When a child goes missing, the first 48 hours are the most critical. It is a window of time where hope battles against statistics, where families usually freeze in a state of paralyzed terror, waiting by the phone for a detective to call. But in March of 2015, when 18-year-old Angelica Hadsell vanished from her home in Norfolk, Virginia, her stepfather, Wesley Hadsell, didn't freeze. He didn't wait. He launched himself into the center of the storm. To the local news cameras and the community, Wesley was the picture of a desperate, devoted father. He was out searching the woods, putting up flyers on every telephone pole, and even breaking into the homes of neighbors he claimed were suspicious. He told reporters, with tears in his eyes, that he would tear the world apart to find his daughter. But investigators, watching his frantic performance, quickly noticed something strange. Wesley wasn't just searching for Angelica. He seemed to be directing the movie. And the harder he tried to point the finger at everyone else, the more the police began to realize that the danger wasn't lurking in the woods. It was standing right in front of the camera. This is the story of a man who thought he could outsmart the police by playing the hero in a tragedy he created himself. Angelica Hadsell was a bright, vibrant freshman at Longwood University. She was the kind of girl who lit up a room. Athletic, smart, and fiercely loved by her mother and friends. In March 2015, she came home for spring break, looking forward to a week of relaxing, catching up with high school friends, and enjoying the comforts of home. Her stepfather, Wesley, had been in her life for years. To the outside world, they looked like a functioning, blended family. But beneath the facade of a normal suburban life, the foundation was rotting. Wesley had a dark past that many didn't know the full extent of. A history of bank robbery and erratic criminal behavior. He had supposedly reformed, but shortly before Angelica came home for break, the tension in the house had reached a boiling point. Wesley had been kicked out of the family home by his wife due to his drug use and increasingly volatile outbursts. He was living in a hotel, angry, desperate, and losing control over the family he viewed as his possession. When Angelica arrived home, she walked into the middle of this domestic war zone. She was the innocent pawn in a crumbling marriage. On March 2nd, 2015, she was texting her friends, making plans, sending the kind of mundane messages that teenagers send every day. And then, silence. The text stopped. Her phone went dead. When her family couldn't reach her, panic set in immediately. Her mother rushed home to find a scene that didn't make sense. There was no sign of a violent struggle, no broken glass, no blood. But Angelica was gone. It was as if she had simply evaporated. From the moment the police were called, Wesley inserted himself into the investigation with an intensity that made seasoned detectives uncomfortable. He wasn't just helpful, he was aggressive. He began pointing fingers immediately, spinning wild theories that Angelica had been taken by drug dealers or human traffickers. He told police he had his own leads and that he wasn't going to wait for them to do their jobs. Then, things got bizarre. Wesley admitted to breaking into the home of a neighbor. He claimed he found Angelica's jacket inside the neighbor's house and retrieved it as evidence. He held it up to the cameras, claiming he had cracked the case. He even went on national television, appearing on Nancy Grace, painting himself as the vigilante father fighting against an incompetent police force. But police knew that finding evidence in a burglarized home wasn't heroics, it was contamination. And they suspected it was planted. Why would a neighbor kidnap Angelica, but leave her jacket in plain sight for her stepfather to find? It felt staged. It felt like a man trying to frame someone else. While Wesley was playing detective for the news crews, real detectives were quietly building a timeline of his movements. They started tracking him electronically. If he was really searching for her, his GPS data would show him driving grid patterns, looking for clues. Instead, the GPS on his work van told a much darker story. The data showed that shortly after Angelica disappeared, Wesley drove to an abandoned, remote property in Southampton County, miles away from their home. It was a desolate place, surrounded by tall grass and decaying structures. He had no reason to be there. The GPS showed he stayed there for a specific amount of time, then left. He then went to a convenience store, where surveillance footage captured him buying a shovel and work gloves. He wasn't buying supplies to search for a living girl. He was buying supplies to bury a dead one. The police brought Wesley in for questioning. The hero dad act began to crumble under the pressure of the interrogation room. He was agitated, defensive, and his stories kept shifting. First, he was searching for her. Then, he claimed he was kidnapped by the same people who took her. His lies were becoming desperate and nonsensical. But the physical evidence was undeniable. Inside Wesley's hotel room, the place he was staying after being kicked out, police found ammunition. It was a specific type of ammo. And in the back of his work van, they found a shovel with fresh dirt still clinging to the blade. Following the GPS data from Wesley's van, police were led back to that desolate, abandoned house in Southampton County near the North Carolina border. They searched the grounds, looking for fresh earth. It didn't take long. Behind the house, in a shallow grave covered by debris, they found the body of 18-year-old Angelica Hadsell. The discovery shattered the hopes of a community that had been praying for her safe return. The autopsy revealed a brutal, chaotic end to her life. She had not been kidnapped by traffickers. She had been beaten and poisoned. The toxicology report showed lethal levels of heroin in her system, 3 times the lethal dose. But Angelica wasn't a drug user. Police believed Wesley had injected her with the drugs to subdue her or kill her quietly, perhaps trying to make it look like an overdose. But when the drugs didn't work fast enough, or when she fought back, he resorted to extreme physical violence. The motive was twisted. Prosecutors believed Wesley wanted to save Angelica to be the hero and win his wife back, or perhaps he had made sexual advances that were rejected, leading to a rage-fueled murder when she threatened to expose him. Wesley Hadsell maintained his innocence for years. He played games with the court, fired attorneys, and delayed the trial, dragging out the pain for Angelica's mother. But in 2022, 7 years after Angelica vanished, he finally faced a jury. The evidence was overwhelming. The GPS data, the shovel, the heroin, and the evidence he planted to frame a neighbor. The jury saw through the mask of the grieving stepfather. They saw a predator who had used his stepdaughter's life as a prop in his own sick drama. Wesley Hadsell was found guilty of first-degree murder and concealment of a dead body. The judge, disgusted by Wesley's lack of remorse and his manipulation of the media, sentenced him to life in prison plus 15 years. He thought he could write the script of his own heroism. Instead, he wrote the story of his own life sentence. He will die in prison, remembered not as the father who searched, but as the monster who hid her. Case number 2. Gary Green. In the suburbs of Dallas, Texas, a family home is supposed to be a sanctuary. It is supposed to be the one place where the outside world can't hurt you, where the doors are locked against the dangers of the night. But for Lovetta Armstead and her 3 children, the danger wasn't outside. It was sitting at the dinner table. It was sleeping in a master bedroom. In September of 2009, that danger would finally reveal its true face in a way that would shake the entire state of Texas. This is the story of a man who was told his marriage was over, and instead of walking away, he decided that if he couldn't have his family, no one would. This is the story of a man who didn't just commit a murder. He announced his transformation into a monster in writing, and then proceeded to prove it. Gary Green and Lovetta Armstead had been married for only a short time, but the relationship was already fracturing under the weight of his instability. To the outside world, they looked like a normal couple trying to blend their families in the Oak Cliff neighborhood. Lovetta was a strong, hardworking mother who had 3 children from previous relationships, 2 sons, 12-year-old Jerome and 9-year-old Jarrett, and a beaming 6-year-old daughter named Jasmine Montgomery. Gary had come into their lives promising stability, but behind closed doors, he was unraveling. His behavior was becoming erratic, paranoid, and controlling. He believed people were plotting against him. He heard voices, and most dangerously, he viewed Lovetta not as a partner, but as a possession. By the fall of 2009, Lovetta had reached her breaking point. She was a devoted mother who wanted peace for her children, and she realized she couldn't find it with Gary. On September 21st, she sat down and wrote him 2 letters. They were kind but firm, the words of a woman trying to de-escalate a volatile situation. She explained that she loved him, but she had to do what was best for herself and her children. She was asking for an annulment. She wanted him to leave. She placed the letters where he would find them, hoping they could end things civilly. She thought she was negotiating a breakup. She didn't realize she was triggering a massacre. Gary Green didn't read those letters as a request for separation. He read them as a declaration of war. His response was not to pack his bags, but to pick up a pen. On a piece of paper that would later become the most chilling piece of evidence in the courtroom, Gary wrote a reply that revealed exactly what was going through his mind. He wrote, "You asked to see the monster, so here he is, the monster you made me." He ended the note with a specific, calculated promise. "There will be 5 lives taken today, me being the 5th. He intended to annihilate the entire family, Lovetta, her 3 children, and finally, himself. This wasn't a crime of passion in the heat of the moment. It was a premeditated execution plan." That evening, the violence began. Gary waited until the house was quiet. He didn't use a gun, which would have been loud and quick. He chose methods that were intimate, personal, and brutal. He started with Lovetta. In the master bedroom, the place where she had felt safest, he attacked her with a steak knife. It wasn't a quick attack. Evidence showed she was stabbed more than 24 times. She fought for her life, desperate to protect the children sleeping down the hall, but she was overpowered by the rage of the man she had once trusted. But the horror didn't end in the bedroom. Gary then turned his attention to 6-year-old Jasmine. She was innocent, small, and completely defenseless. The cruelty of what happened next is difficult to comprehend. He didn't just attack her. He took her into the bathroom and filled the tub. In a final act of unimaginable malice, he drowned her. The little girl who loved to sing and dance was silenced by her own stepfather, held underwater by the hands that were supposed to care for her. He washed the knife in the same water he used to kill her, a detail that speaks to a level of detachment that is truly psychopathic. Then, Gary went for the boys. Jerome, who was 12, and Jarrett, who was 9, were terrified. They had heard the chaos. When Gary came for them, he had already taken 2 lives. He herded them into the hallway. But in a moment that defies explanation, the boys managed to do the only thing they could. They pleaded with him. They didn't fight, they begged. The 9-year-old, Jarrett, staring at the man who had just murdered his mother and sister, reportedly looked him in the eye and said, "We're too little to die." Something in that plea broke through Gary's rage. He stopped. He didn't kill them, but he didn't let them go immediately either. In a twisted act of psychological torture that would haunt them forever, he forced the young boys to look at the bodies of their mother and sister. He wanted them to see what the monster had done. He told them he loved them, confusing their terror with affection, and then he went to the bedroom to fulfill the last part of his letter. He swallowed a massive amount of Tylenol and Benadryl, attempting to overdose and escape the consequences of his actions. But the suicide attempt failed. Gary didn't die. He woke up, groggy and alive, to realize the police were closing in. The boys, who had been terrified into silence, were eventually rescued. They were physically unharmed, but they were emotionally scarred in a way that no surgery could ever fix. They had walked through a house of horrors and survived by the grace of a single sentence. When the case went to trial, Gary's defense team tried to argue insanity. They pointed to his history of mental health issues, his paranoia, and the voices he claimed to hear. They argued he was a man who had lost his grip on reality. But the prosecution had the letter. "You asked to see the monster." That sentence proved premeditation. It proved he knew exactly what he was doing. He wasn't in a fugue state. He was acting out of spite and revenge. He wanted to punish Lovetta for leaving him, and he wanted to make sure she suffered the ultimate loss. The jury didn't buy the insanity defense. They saw the calculated nature of the crime. The letter, the drowning, the stabbing, the sparing of the boys after they begged. They convicted Gary Green of capital murder. And in Texas, capital murder of a child under 10 often leads to one outcome. He was sentenced to death. For over a decade, Gary sat on death row. He appealed, delaying the inevitable, but his time finally ran out. On March 7, 2023, Gary Green was strapped to the gurney in the execution chamber at Huntsville. In his final moments, he looked through the glass at the witnesses. He didn't offer excuses. He offered an apology. He said, "I took not one, but two people that we all loved. We were all one, and I broke that bond." He asked for forgiveness, not for his sake, but so the family could heal. At 7:07 p.m., the lethal injection was administered, and the monster he claimed to be was gone. But the execution of Gary Green doesn't undo the night of September 21st, 2009. Lovetta and Jasmine are gone. And somewhere in Texas, there are two young men who, as children, had to beg for their lives in their own hallway. They survived, but they carry the weight of knowing that the man who raised them was capable of extinguishing their world simply because his ego was bruised. Gary Green wanted to be remembered as a monster, and in the end, that is the only legacy he left behind. Case number 3, Thomas McClellan. It is often said that patience is the most essential virtue of parenting. Children are messy, they are loud, and they are demanding. They require a level of selflessness that not every adult possesses. We expect parents to take a deep breath when things get frustrating. We expect them to understand that a child's needs are not an inconvenience, but a responsibility. But in November of 2016, inside a quiet apartment in Delhi Township, Michigan, a 5-year-old girl named Luna Younger would discover that her stepfather didn't just lack patience. He lacked a soul. This is the story of a man who decided that a child's simple request for a snack was a capital offense, and that the only way to silence a hungry little girl was to burn the evidence of her existence. It is a case that leaves us asking how a human being can go from sitting on a couch to committing an atrocity in the span of a single heartbeat. Thomas McClellan was 25 years old and had only been a stepfather for a few months. He had recently married Luna's mother, Victoria, and on paper, they looked like a young couple starting a new chapter. Victoria worked hard to provide for her daughter, and she trusted Thomas. She believed he was adjusting to his new role as a father figure. But Thomas was living a lie. He wasn't adjusting. He was seething. He was a man who valued his own peace and quiet above the life of the child entrusted to his care. He viewed Luna not as a daughter to be loved, but as a nuisance to be tolerated. He was a man who wanted the perks of adult life without the interruptions of a child's reality. On the morning of November 1st, 2016, Victoria left for work. It was supposed to be an ordinary day. Luna was home with Thomas. The dynamic in the apartment was quiet, but the tension was there, simmering just beneath the surface. Thomas wanted to relax. He wanted a nap. He wanted to exist in a world where he didn't have responsibilities. But a 5-year-old girl doesn't understand the concept of a stepfather's bad mood. She only understands her own needs. And that afternoon, Luna's need was simple. She was hungry. Around 5 p.m., Luna approached Thomas. She didn't scream, she didn't throw a tantrum, and she didn't break anything. She simply knocked on his bedroom door and told him she was hungry. She wanted something to eat. It was a request that any parent has heard 1,000 times. A cracker, a juice box, a sandwich. It would have taken 2 minutes to solve. But for Thomas McClellan, that knock on the door was the catalyst for a nightmare. Something inside him snapped. He didn't just get annoyed, he went into a blind rage. According to his later confession, the interruption triggered a level of violence that is impossible to rationalize. He grabbed the 5-year-old girl and threw her to the ground. He then sat on top of her, pinning her small body to the floor so she couldn't move. But he didn't stop there. He reached for a pocket knife. In a moment of cold, calculated brutality, he stabbed his stepdaughter 5 times in the chest. The violence was intimate and personal. He looked her in the eyes as he took her life, all because she had dared to ask for food during his quiet time. Once the red mist of rage faded, the cold reality of what he had done set in. Luna was dead. Thomas was now a murderer. But he didn't call 911. He didn't try to perform CPR. His survival instinct kicked in, and he decided to erase the crime. He knew he couldn't explain the stab wounds, so he decided to destroy the body. He gathered Luna's lifeless form, wrapped her in blankets, and poured vodka all over her and the pile of linens. Then he lit a match. He set the apartment on fire, hoping the flames would reduce everything to ash, the body, the knife, and the truth. He then grabbed his keys and fled the scene, leaving his stepdaughter burning in the bedroom while the fire alarms began to scream. He believed that fire would be the ultimate cleanser, that the chaos of a burning building would hide the specificity of his crime. Firefighters arrived quickly. They battled the smoke and flames, thinking they were fighting a standard structure fire. But when they entered the bedroom, they found something that stopped them in their tracks. Underneath this smoldering pile of blankets, they found Luna. The fire hadn't done what Thomas hoped it would. It hadn't incinerated her. It had only singed the evidence. When a medical examiner looked at her body, the stab wounds were clearly visible. This wasn't an accidental death in a fire. This was a homicide. Police tracked Thomas down within hours. He hadn't gone far. When they brought him in for interrogation, he didn't fight like a mastermind. He crumbled. He confessed to everything, describing the murder with a chilling lack of emotion. He told the detectives about the knock on the door, the demand for a snack, and the urging he felt to make her stop. He described the stabbing as if he were recounting a mundane chore, a necessary task to get back to his nap. The trial was brief because the evidence was overwhelming. The defense tried to argue that it was a sudden loss of control, a momentary lapse of reason, but the jury saw the brutality for what it was. During the sentencing, the judge, Justice Joyce Dragonchuck, struggled to find words to describe the horror of the case. She looked at Thomas and said, "I don't think there is any punishment that I can give you that would ever make up for what you did." She noted that a person who could murder a child over a snack had zero chance of rehabilitation. There is no therapy for that kind of evil. Thomas McClellan was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He will never walk free again. He will die in a cell, likely spending decades thinking about the 5-year-old girl who just wanted something to eat. And outside the prison walls, a mother is left with the ashes of a life that was stolen by the man she thought she could trust. Luna Younger's life was extinguished not because she was in danger, but because she was an inconvenience. And that is a terrifying thought for every parent who trusts someone else to watch their child. Case number 4. Daniel Spencer. In the world of criminal justice, we operate under a fragile social contract. We, the public, agree to follow the laws, and in exchange, the system agrees to protect us from those who refuse to do so. We trust that when a predator is caught, the gates will slam shut. We trust that a judge, the ultimate arbiter of safety, will look at a monster and see him for what he is. But in Tallahassee, Florida, in the summer of 2021, that contract was broken in the most devastating way possible. This is the story of a 5-year-old girl named Missy, who was sacrificed on the altar of a second chance, and a stepfather named Daniel Spencer, who proved that true evil doesn't need a weapon. It just needs an opportunity. This wasn't just a murder. It was a systemic failure that allowed a wolf to walk right back into the nursery. To understand the tragedy of what happened inside the home on Kipling Court, you first have to understand the man who was allowed to live there. Daniel Spencer was 32 years old, living with his girlfriend, Chloe, and her young daughter, Missy Mogul. To the casual observer, he might have seemed like just another boyfriend trying to step into a fatherly role. But Daniel Spencer was not a safe man. He was a ticking time bomb that law enforcement had already identified. By the time he moved into Missy's home, Spencer was already on the radar. He wasn't just a guy with a bad temper. He was a man with a documented interest in harming children. He had been arrested and charged with traveling to meet a minor for unlawful sexual conduct. This is a specific predatory charge that implies planning, intent, and a desire to victimize the most vulnerable members of society. The turning point, the moment where Missy's fate was effectively sealed, didn't happen in the bedroom where she died. It happened in a courtroom weeks earlier. Daniel Spencer stood before a judge, facing these serious felony charges. The prosecution was clear. This man is a danger. The nature of his charges involves children. He should not be out on the streets, and he certainly should not be in a home with a child. The state attorney's office fought to keep him behind bars, or, at the very least, to have his bond revoked so he could not return to the community while awaiting trial. This was the moment for the system to work. This was the moment for the safety net to catch the falling child. Instead, the judge made a decision that would later spark outrage across the entire state of Florida. Despite the severity of the charges and the clear risk he posed, the judge granted Daniel Spencer bond. He was allowed to walk out of the courtroom. He was allowed to return to his life. He was allowed to go back to the very environment where he could do the most damage. Spencer returned to the home on Kipling Court. One can only imagine the tension in that house. A man accused of sexual crimes against a minor was now sleeping down the hall from a 5-year-old girl. The system had effectively handed him a permission slip to be there. On June 15, 2021, the protection of the court meant nothing. The only thing that mattered was the reality of what Daniel Spencer was capable of when no one was watching. Or, at least, when he thought no one was watching. The house was equipped with a surveillance system. These cameras, intended to provide security for the family, would instead become the silent witnesses to a torture session. The footage that investigators later recovered is the stuff of nightmares. Not because of jump scares or gore, but because of the cold, methodical cruelty it captured. The video showed Daniel Spencer in the bedroom with 5-year-old Missy. She wasn't acting out. She wasn't being difficult. She was just existing. But for Spencer, her existence was a problem. The footage captured him physically abusing her. He was seen grabbing her, shoving her, and maneuvering her small body with a level of aggression that is difficult to comprehend. This wasn't discipline. It was domination. At one point in the footage, the true depth of his depravity was revealed. He didn't just hit her. He restrained her. He bound her hands and feet behind her back. Imagine the terror of a 5-year-old girl, unable to move, unable to run, looking up at the man who is supposed to be her guardian. He rendered her completely defenseless. But he didn't stop there. The footage showed Spencer taking heavy pillows and comforters and piling them on top of her. He created a suffocating tomb of bedding. He pressed her face in the mattress, using his weight and the weight of the bedding to cut off her air supply. Perhaps the most chilling detail from the police report is a moment of pause. After exerting himself, after struggling to crush the life out of a 40-pound child, Daniel Spencer was seen on camera pausing to wipe sweat from his forehead. It was a mundane, human reaction to physical exertion. It showed that this was hard work for him. He was sweating. He was tired. But he didn't stop. He wiped his brow, composed himself, and continued the murder. Missy fought. The autopsy would later reveal injuries consistent with a struggle. But she was 5. He was a grown man. She didn't stand a chance. She died of asphyxiation, smothered in her own bed, just feet away from where she kept her toys. When the police were finally called to the scene, the story Spencer tried to tell began to unravel immediately. He tried to claim he found her unresponsive, playing the role of the frantic stepfather. But modern technology is the enemy of a liar. The police secured the surveillance hard drive. They didn't need a confession. They had the movie. When the news broke, the community of Tallahassee didn't just grieve, they raged. The details of his prior charges became public knowledge. People realized that this wasn't an unpredictable tragedy. It was a preventable one. The anger was directed at Spencer, yes, but a massive wave of fury was directed at the judicial decision that set him free. Attorney General James Uthmere took the unusual step of publicly commenting on the case, highlighting the failure of the bond system. The state attorney announced they would be seeking the death penalty, arguing that the crime was heinous, atrocious, and cruel. Daniel Spencer is currently awaiting trial, where he faces the ultimate punishment. But for Missy Mogul, justice is a concept that comes too late. She was failed by her stepfather, but she was also failed by the abstract principles of a legal system that prioritized the freedom of a predator over the safety of a child. This case serves as a grim reminder that a background check is useless if the system ignores the results. Daniel Spencer is a monster, yes. But he's a monster who was given a hall pass by the state of Florida, and he used it to destroy a life that was just beginning. Case number 5. William Balfour. Fame often creates an illusion of invincibility. When we see people on magazine covers, winning Oscars, or singing on the world's biggest stages, we imagine their lives are untouchable. We assume they're protected by high gates, private security, and the kind of good fortune that keeps the darkness at bay. But in October of 2008, the world was reminded that tragedy does not check your bank account or your celebrity status before it kicks down the front door. Violent crime doesn't care if your sister is an Academy Award winner. It doesn't care if the entire world is watching. This is the story of a man whose jealousy was so consuming, so toxic, that he decided to extinguish an entire family legacy just to prove a point. He wasn't a stranger lurking in the bushes. He was the man sitting at the breakfast table. He was the estranged husband who had promised to love and protect, but instead brought death to the south side of Chicago. This is the case of William Balfour, the man who destroyed the family of Jennifer Hudson. To understand the absolute horror of what happened inside the Hudson family home, you have to understand the man who felt entitled to control it. William Balfour was known on the streets by the nickname Flex. He was a member of the Gangster Disciples, and his resume was not one of family man. It was one of a career criminal. By the time he entered the Hudson family's orbit, he already had convictions for attempted murder and vehicular hijacking. He was a man who solved his problems with violence and intimidation. Yet, he had managed to charm his way into the life of Julia Hudson, the sister of the rising superstar Jennifer Hudson. They married in 2006, but the honeymoon phase was non-existent. The relationship was a cycle of possession, paranoia, and psychological warfare. Balfour didn't view Julia as a wife. He viewed her as property. He lived in her mother's home on Yale Avenue, but he didn't contribute to the peace of that home. He slowly dismantled it. By early 2008, Julia had reached her limit. The relationship was crumbling under the weight of Balfour's erratic behavior and infidelity. She kicked him out. For most people, a breakup is a painful transition, but for a narcissist like Balfour, it was an insult that required retribution. He began stalking the house. He would drive by at all hours, watching who came and went, obsessively checking to see if Julia had moved on. He repeatedly told Julia, "If you ever leave me, I will kill you." But as the weeks went on, the threat evolved into something even more specific and chilling. He told her, "I'll kill your family first. You'll be the last to die." It was a promise to leave her alive in a world of grief, to make her suffer the loss of everything she loved before he finally dealt with her. On the morning of October 24th, 2008, that promise became a reality. It was a Friday. Julia left for work, leaving the house on Yale Avenue quiet. Inside were 3 people: her 57-year-old mother, Darnell Donnerson, her 29-year-old brother, Jason Hudson, and her bright, innocent 7-year-old son, Julian King. Balfour arrived at the house shortly after Julia left. He had seen a gift of balloons delivered for Julia, a birthday gift from her new boyfriend. That simple, happy gesture, a bundle of colorful balloons, was the trigger that set off a massacre. It was the proof he needed that she was moving on, and his ego couldn't handle it. Balfour entered the house. He likely used his key, or Darnell opened the door for the man she still considered son-in-law. He found Darnell Donnerson in the living room. She was the matriarch, the rock of the family, the woman who had encouraged Jennifer to sing. He shot her multiple times, leaving her on the floor of the home she had made a sanctuary. The violence was sudden and explosive. He then moved to the bedroom where Jason was sleeping. Jason was shot twice in the head before he could even defend himself. In a matter of seconds, the history and the future of the Hudson family were being erased. But the most terrifying part of Balfour's plan was what he did next. He didn't shoot 7-year-old Julian inside the house. Perhaps he ran out of bullets, or perhaps he had a darker purpose. He snatched the terrified boy from his bed. He dragged the child out to Jason's white Chevrolet SUV, forced him inside, and drove away. He stole the child to use him as leverage, or perhaps just to prolong the torture for Julia. When Julia returned home later that afternoon, she walked into a nightmare. She found her mother's body. She found her brother. But the silence where her son should have been was deafening. The police were called, and an Amber Alert was issued. Because of Jennifer Hudson's fame, the face of 7-year-old Julian King was flashed across every television screen in America. The search was massive. The FBI was involved. For 3 days, the city of Chicago held its breath. Jennifer Hudson, paralyzed by grief, offered a $100,000 reward for the safe return of her nephew. The entire country was looking for that white SUV. But William Balfour had no intention of returning him. 3 days later, the white SUV was found parked on a quiet street on the west side of Chicago, miles from the crime scene. Police approached the vehicle with dread. Inside, lying in the rear seat, they found Julian. He had been shot in the head. Balfour had covered the boy's body with a shower curtain, abandoned the car, and walked away as if he hadn't just executed a child. The cruelty was absolute. He had killed the boy solely to hurt his mother. The investigation into Balfour dismantled his lies piece by piece. When police brought him in, he played the role of the concerned, estranged husband. He was calm, almost bored. He claimed he hadn't been near the house. He claimed he used public transportation all day. But technology betrayed him. His cell phone pinged off towers near the Hudson home at the exact time of the murders. Even more damning was his transit card. The card he claimed he was using to ride the bus all day. Police pulled the data. The card had not been swiped. His entire alibi was a fabrication. Detectives also found the murder weapon, a .45 caliber handgun, in a nearby vacant lot. Ballistics matched the bullets found in all 3 victims. Gunshot residue was found on the steering wheel of his car. Witnesses came forward, including a friend who admitted Balfour had asked him to lie about his whereabouts. The concerned father figure mask was ripped off, revealing a cold-blooded executioner who had planned the timeline to try and outsmart the police. The trial in 2012 was an emotional marathon. Jennifer Hudson sat in the courtroom every day, sobbing as the details of her family's final moments were read aloud. She was the first witness called, and she had to look into the eyes of the man she had once welcomed into her family. Balfour sat stone-faced, showing zero remorse. His defense tried to argue that the police had tunnel vision because of the family's celebrity, suggesting they just wanted to close the case quickly. But the jury wasn't swayed. The evidence was scientific, corroborative, and irrefutable. The verdict came back swiftly, guilty on all counts. At the sentencing, Judge Charles Burns didn't hold back. He looked at Balfour and delivered one of the most scathing assessments ever heard in a Cook County courtroom. He said, "You have the heart of an Arctic night. Your soul is as barren as dark space." He sentenced him to 3 consecutive life terms plus 120 years. He was given no possibility of parole. William Balfour was sent to the Stateville Correctional Center, where he remains today. He is a man who tried to control a woman by destroying her world, only to end up with no control over anything, not even the time he wakes up in the morning. This case stands as a brutal reminder that domestic violence is a plague that can touch anyone, anywhere, regardless of fame or fortune. Case number 6, Scott Walker. In the modern age, we leave digital footprints everywhere we go. We post statuses, we send text, we like photos, and we share our locations. For parents of missing teenagers, these digital signals are often the only lifeline they have, a desperate sign that their child is still out there, safe, just not ready to come home yet. But in Peterborough, England, in July of 2020, investigators discovered a chilling truth that turns our reliance on technology against us. They learned that sometimes the person updating the status isn't the missing teenager. Sometimes it is the killer sitting in the next room, holding the phone of the girl he just murdered, pretending to be her. This is the story of Scott Walker, a stepfather who didn't just take a life. He stole a voice, using it to gaslight an entire family and a police force while the 17-year-old girl he killed lay undiscovered in the darkness. Bernadette Walker was a typical 17-year-old girl, creative, slightly rebellious, and deeply attached to her friends. She lived in a crowded, somewhat chaotic house with her mother, Sarah, and her stepfather, Scott Walker. To the outside world, Scott presented himself as the strict but loving patriarch. He was the one who enforced the rules. He was the one who kept the family in line. But inside the home, the dynamic was far more sinister. Scott wasn't just strict. He was obsessive. He monitored phones, he controlled movements, and he had developed an unhealthy, predatory fixation on his stepdaughter. Bernadette had begun to confide in people that Scott had been sexually abusing her, a secret that threatened to destroy the carefully constructed world Scott had built. The walls were closing in on him, and he knew it. On the morning of July 18, 2020, Scott picked Bernadette up from her grandparents' house. She had stayed there the night before, seeking a bit of refuge from the tension at home. When she got into his car that morning, she was alive. She was likely anxious, knowing she was alone with the man she feared most, but she had no reason to believe she wouldn't make it to her destination. Scott claimed he was driving her home to pick up some clothes because she was going to stay with his parents for a while. It was a mundane errand, but Bernadette never made it home, and she never made it to his parents' house. Somewhere in the span of that car ride, the stepfather vanished, and the killer emerged. According to Scott's initial story, the car ride ended in a roadside argument. He claimed Bernadette got angry, demanded to be let out of the car, and ran away into the countryside. He told her mother, Sarah, that she had just done a runner. For a teenager with a rebellious streak, this was a plausible story. It was the kind of thing that happens in families all the time. But what happened next was a masterclass in digital manipulation that kept the truth buried for weeks. Almost immediately after she supposedly ran away, Bernadette's phone began sending messages. Texts went out to her mother and her friends, assuring them she was fine but just needed space. I'm okay, the messages read. I'm staying with a friend. Don't worry, I'll call you soon. For weeks, these messages kept the police at bay. After all, why would you launch a massive murder investigation for a girl who is texting you back? The text provided a false sense of security, a digital heartbeat for a girl whose real heart had already stopped beating. But the people who knew Bernadette best felt something was wrong almost immediately. The syntax was off. The spelling was different. Bernadette had a specific way of speaking, a teenage slang, and a rhythm that the texter couldn't quite replicate. The messages were too formal, too cold, or used phrases that Bernadette simply wouldn't use. They didn't sound like a 17-year-old girl. They sounded like a 50-year-old man trying to sound like a 17-year-old girl. Her friends messaged back, asking simple questions only Bernadette would know the answer to, but the replies were vague and evasive. And crucially, she never answered a voice call. She was a ghost in the machine. Police eventually seized the family's electronics, and the digital facade crumbled. They discovered that during the time Bernadette was supposedly safe with a friend, her phone had been disconnected from the network for long periods, only reconnecting when Scott was near Wi-Fi. The messages were being sent via the internet, often at times when Scott Walker was known to be alone with his phone. Even more damning, prosecutors found that Scott had hacked into her social media accounts. He was logging in, posting updates, and changing passwords to lock everyone else out. He was puppeteering a dead girl to cover his tracks. The investigation turned from a missing person case to a murder inquiry. Police analyzed the GPS data from Scott's car on the day she disappeared. It didn't show him stopping to let her out where he claimed. Instead, it showed him driving to remote, rural locations in the middle of the night, places perfect for hiding a body. But despite massive searches involving drones, divers, and cadaver dogs scouring the countryside, Bernadette's body was never found. Scott had hidden her so well that he denied the family even the dignity of a funeral. He stole her life, and then he stole her resting place. The trial at Cambridge Crown Court was harrowing. Scott Walker stood in the dock, arrogant and defiant. He denied killing her. He stuck to his story that she ran away, claiming the GPS data and the phone evidence were just coincidences. But the prosecution laid out the motive clearly. Bernadette had written in a diary about the sexual abuse. She was on the verge of exposing him to the authorities. Scott killed her to silence her, then used the fake text to buy himself time to dispose of the body and construct an alibi. The jury saw through the lies. They convicted Scott Walker of murder and perverting the course of justice. In a tragic twist, they also convicted Bernadette's mother, Sarah, of perverting the course of justice. While she didn't kill her daughter, the jury believed she knew the texts were fake and helped maintain the lie to protect Scott, choosing her husband over the memory of her child. When the judge, Mrs. Justice McGowan, passed the sentence, she didn't hold back. She told Scott, "Your behavior was controlling and manipulative. You killed her to prevent your sexual abuse of her being discovered." She sentenced him to life in prison with a minimum term of 32 years. Scott Walker thought he could control the narrative by typing out a few text messages. He thought he could erase Bernadette Walker from the earth. But while he may have hidden her body, he couldn't hide the truth. He remains in prison today, a man who silenced a girl's voice only to have that silence scream his guilt to the world. And somewhere in the English countryside, Bernadette Walker is still waiting to be found, a victim of the ultimate betrayal by the man who was supposed to protect her. Case number 7. Jesse McFadden. In rural Oklahoma, trust is a currency more valuable than gold. In small towns like Henrietta, people know their neighbors, they leave their doors unlocked, and they believe that a man's word is his bond. It is a place where a weekend sleepover at a friend's ranch is a rite of passage, a safe and wholesome way for teenagers to spend a spring weekend. Parents drop their kids off with a wave and a smile, believing that the other adults in the community are looking out for them with the same protective instinct they have for their own. But in May of 2023, the small town of Henrietta learned a lesson that would shatter that trust forever. They learned that sometimes the friendly neighbor offering a place to stay is actually a predator running out of time. This is the story of a man who knew his life was over, and instead of facing his fate alone, he decided to turn a family home into a mass grave. This is the case of Jesse McFadden, a man whose final act of cowardice destroyed not just one family, but the peace of an entire community. On the surface, the weekend of April 29th, 2023 seemed perfectly normal, even idyllic. Two teenage girls, 14-year-old Ivy Webster and 16-year-old Brittany Brewer, were excited. They were heading over to the McFadden property to spend the weekend with their friend, Tiffany Guess. It was supposed to be a fun few days of hanging out, working on the ranch, and enjoying the open air of the Oklahoma countryside. Jesse McFadden, Tiffany's stepfather, was the one driving them. To the girls' parents, Jesse seemed like a decent enough guy, a bit rough around the edges maybe, but he was a father figure who seemed involved in his stepchildren's lives. When Brittany's father dropped her off, he shook Jesse's hand. He trusted him. He had no idea that when he watched his daughter climb into that truck, he was watching her leave this world. What the parents didn't know, and what the community had largely forgotten or chosen to ignore, was that Jesse McFadden was living on borrowed time. He was a registered sex offender with a violent, checkered past. He had been released from prison years earlier, but he hadn't reformed. In fact, he had gotten worse. Beneath the facade of the rancher and family man, he was a predator who had continued his illicit activities. But the clock was ticking. Jesse was scheduled to stand trial that very coming Monday, May 1st, for soliciting sexual conduct from a minor and possessing child pornography. The evidence against him was solid. The legal walls were closing in. He was looking at decades in prison, a virtual life sentence. His life as a free man was going to end in less than 48 hours. Most men in his position would have two choices: flee the country or face the music. But Jesse McFadden had a different plan, one that was purely nihilistic and born of a deep, festering hatred for the world. If he was going down, he was going to take everyone with him. He wanted to exert total control one last time. The alarm wasn't raised immediately. The weekend passed. But when Sunday night turned into Monday morning and the girls hadn't returned home, panic began to set in. Monday was the day Jesse was supposed to be in court. The courthouse opened, the lawyers arrived, and the judge took the bench. But the defendant's chair was empty. When Jesse failed to show up for his trial, the judge issued a bench warrant for his arrest. Suddenly, the police weren't just looking for a man who skipped bail. They were looking for a man who had vanished with his wife, Holly, her 3 children, Tiffany, Michael, and Riley, and the 2 visiting friends, Ivy and Brittany. An Amber Alert was issued. The faces of the missing teenagers were plastered across social media and flashed on highway signs. The search teams descended on the McFadden property, a sprawling piece of land that offered plenty of places to hide. Officers combed through the house, the barns, and the dense woods surrounding the area. The atmosphere was heavy with dread. Everyone hoped they had just gone on the run, that perhaps Jesse had taken them hostage and they could still be negotiated for. But as the hours ticked by, that hope began to fade. Hours into the search, the worst possible outcome was realized. Near a creek on the property, searchers found the bodies. It wasn't just 1 or 2. It was a massacre. They found 7 victims. Jesse had systematically executed his entire family. His wife Holly, her 3 children, 17-year-old Tiffany, 15-year-old Michael, and 13-year-old Riley, and the 2 visiting girls, Ivy and Brittany. After slaughtering 6 innocent people, Jesse McFadden turned the gun on himself. The details that emerged in the aftermath were sickening. It was revealed that Jesse had likely kept his dark side hidden from his wife, Holly, or perhaps she was too terrified to speak up. They had met while he was in prison. A prison pen pal romance that ended in the ultimate tragedy. Holly had married him hoping for a second chance at happiness, inadvertently bringing her children into a home that became their tomb. But the anger in the community wasn't just directed at the dead man. It was directed at the system that allowed him to be free. How was a convicted rapist and sex offender allowed to live unsupervised with teenage children? Why was he out on bail when he was facing such severe new charges involving minors? The parents of Ivy and Brittany were devastated, realizing that the background check they assumed had been done by the state had failed them. They had trusted a monster because the law allowed the monster to walk among them. They asked a question that has no good answer. Why was he allowed to play dad when the court knew exactly what he was? The medical examiner's report confirmed the brutality of the end. The victims had been shot. There was no escape, no chance for survival. Jesse had likely planned this for weeks, waiting for the final weekend before his trial to exact his twisted revenge on the world. He wanted control. He wanted to decide when and how he left, and he decided that 6 innocent lives were the price of his exit ticket. He didn't care about the dreams of the teenage girls who were just there for a sleepover. He didn't care about the stepsons he was supposed to raise. He only cared about his own fear of prison. Jesse McFadden is dead, so there will be no trial. There will be no life sentence handed down by a judge. He took the coward's way out, escaping justice by his own hand. But his legacy is one of absolute horror. He is the stepfather who smiled at the neighbors while planning a mass murder. He is the reason why, in Henrietta, Oklahoma, parents now hold their children a little tighter and look at their neighbors with a little more suspicion. He proved that sometimes the most dangerous place a child can be is at a sleepover down the street, in the house of a man who has nothing left to lose. Case number 8, Gregory Graff. We often think of monsters as people who live on the fringes of society, outcasts, drifters, or people who look dangerous from a mile away. We rely on our instincts to warn us when something is wrong. We don't expect the monster to be a successful business owner living in a beautiful home in quiet, rural Pennsylvania. We certainly don't expect him to be the man who raised us, the man who stood beside our mother at family gatherings and shared Thanksgiving dinners. But in November of 2014, the small community of Whitehall Township learned a terrifying lesson. That evil can wear a suit and tie, and it can smile at you from across the kitchen table. This is the story of a stepfather who used his position of trust to lure a mother of 3 into a trap, not for money or revenge, but to satisfy a dark, depraved obsession that he had kept hidden for decades. This is the case of Gregory Graff, a man who proved that sometimes the most dangerous place on earth is your own parents' house. Jessica Paget was a 33-year-old mother who had everything to live for. She was vibrant, hardworking, and deeply devoted to her 3 children and her husband. She worked at a senior living center, a job that suited her caring nature, and she was the kind of person who was always there for her friends and family. On November 21st, 2014, Jessica left her job in the middle of the day to run a simple errand. It was supposed to be a quick trip. She needed to fax some paperwork, and rather than going to a store, she decided to stop by her parents' house to use their machine. It was the most mundane task imaginable. She told her coworkers she would be right back. She drove to the home where her mother and her stepfather, Gregory Graff, lived. She pulled into the driveway, walked through the front door, and was never seen alive again. When Jessica didn't return to work, and when she didn't pick up her children from daycare later that day, the alarm bells rang immediately. Jessica was not the type of person to disappear. She was responsible. She was a mother. Her husband and her sister began a frantic search as the sun went down. They called hospitals, they drove the route she would have taken, and eventually they called Gregory Graff. Graff, a 53-year-old fencing company owner who was well-respected in the area, played the role of the confused stepfather perfectly. He was calm. He admitted she had come over. He told the family that she had used the fax machine and then left. He claimed he didn't know where she went after that. For 5 agonizing days, the community rallied around the family. Search parties combed the woods. Flyers were stapled to every telephone pole in the county, and candlelight vigils were held to pray for her safe return. Gregory Graff was there for it all. He watched the family suffer. He watched Jessica's husband weep. He offered his support, playing the part of the grieving relative, all while knowing that Jessica was never leaving his property. But investigators weren't buying Graff's story. Something about his demeanor was off. And more importantly, there were holes in his timeline. Police began to pull surveillance footage from the businesses and homes near the Graff estate. They saw Jessica's car arrive, but they never saw it leave. The physical evidence contradicted his words. The police obtained a search warrant for the property, a sprawling estate that offered plenty of places to hide secret. They brought in cadaver dogs, trained to detect the scent of death. And on November 26th, 5 days after she vanished, the dogs stopped at a shed in the backyard. There, buried under a pile of debris and dirt, they found the body of Jessica Paget. The discovery of the body was horrific enough, confirming the family's worst nightmare. But the investigation into why she died revealed a level of depravity that shocked even the most hardened detectives. Gregory Graff wasn't protecting a secret or covering up an accidental death. He had hunted her. Police found evidence that Graff had been obsessed with his stepdaughter for years. He had been secretly recording her, spying on her, and harboring a twisted fantasy. But on that Friday in November, he decided to escalate his fantasy into reality. When Jessica walked into the house to use the fax machine, Graff was waiting. He had prepared. As she stood at the machine, her back turned to him, trusting the man who had been a father figure to her for her entire adult life, he pulled out a handgun and shot her in the back of the head. She died instantly. But for Graff, the murder wasn't the end, it was just the beginning. In a twist that makes this case one of the most disturbing in Pennsylvania history, investigators found video files on Graff's computer. He had set up a camera before she arrived. He didn't just murder her. He filmed the act. And then, he filmed himself sexually abusing her lifeless body. He had committed necrophilia, documenting his own atrocity as a trophy to relive later. He then wrapped her body, dragged it to the shed, and buried her, thinking he could simply go back to his life as a respected business owner. He thought he was smart enough to get away with it. Confronted with the overwhelming physical evidence and the video he had made himself, Graff's defense crumbled. He confessed. He tried to claim he was in a drug-induced haze, blaming his actions on medication. But the video showed a man who was calm, calculated, and in complete control. He wasn't hallucinating. He was executing a plan. The legal process was swift because there was no defense for what he had done. To spare the family the trauma of a trial where the graphic video might be shown or described in detail, Graff pleaded guilty to first-degree murder. The courtroom was packed with Jessica's family and friends during the sentencing. Her husband stood up and looked at the man who had destroyed their lives. He called Graff a coward and a predator, voices shaking with a mixture of grief and rage. The judge was equally disgusted, struggling to comprehend the betrayal. He sentenced Gregory Graff to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Gregory Graff will die in a concrete cell. He was a man who had the mask of a suburban success story, but underneath, he was a monster who preyed on the one person who should have been safe in his home. Jessica Paget simply wanted to send a fax. She walked into a nightmare, betrayed by the ultimate evil stepfather. This case serves as a haunting reminder that sometimes the people we trust the most are the ones hiding the darkest secrets, and that a nice house and a good job can be the perfect camouflage for a killer. Case number 9, Gregory Green. The criminal justice system is built on a foundation of optimism. It is built on the idea of rehabilitation, the belief that people can change, that they can serve their time, learn from their mistakes, and re-enter society as better men. We want to believe in second chances. We want to believe that a man who commits a terrible crime in his youth can find God, find peace, and become a productive member of society. But in Dearborn Heights, Michigan, in September of 2016, a woman named Faith Green learned the hard way that some men don't change. They just wait. This is the story of a man who was given a second chance at life after committing a horrific crime, only to use his freedom to orchestrate a massacre that was even worse than his first. This is the case of Gregory Green, the man who proved that sometimes true evil doesn't rehabilitate, it just reloads. To understand the sheer horror of what happened in 2016, you have to go back in time to 1991. That year, a younger Gregory Green stood in a kitchen and made a choice that should have forfeited his freedom forever. He was arrested for the brutal murder of his wife at the time, Tanya. She was 6 months pregnant. In a fit of rage, he stabbed her to death, killing both her and their unborn child. He then called the police himself, waiting calmly for them to arrive. He was convicted of second-degree murder and sent to prison. For most people, that would be the end of the story. But Gregory was a chameleon. Inside the prison walls, he was a model inmate. He was polite, he quoted scripture, and he convinced the parole board that he was a changed man who had found religion. In 2008, after serving 16 years, the state of Michigan opened the gates and released him back into the world. He found support in a local church, where the pastor, believing in the power of redemption, helped Gregory get back on his feet. It was there that he met Faith, a woman with a kind heart and 2 children from a previous relationship, 19-year-old Chadney and 17-year-old Kara Allen. Gregory charmed her. He seemed gentle, humble, and devoted. They married, and soon they had 2 daughters of their own, 5-year-old Coy and 4-year-old Kaylee. To the outside world, it looked like the ultimate redemption story. The murderer had become a family man. The sinner had become a saint. But by the summer of 2016, the mask was slipping. The gentle Gregory had become controlling and volatile. Faith, realizing that her husband was not the man he pretended to be, tried to leave. She filed for divorce. She tried to get a personal protection order, citing his temper and his controlling behavior. But the courts denied the order, seeing no immediate threat. It was a fatal mistake. Gregory Green viewed her departure not as a heartbreak, but as a loss of control. And just like in 1991, he decided that if he couldn't control the situation, he would destroy it. But this time, he wasn't just going to kill his wife. He was going to punish her. On the night of September 21st, 2016, Gregory set his plan in motion. It was a plan designed to cause the maximum amount of suffering for Faith. He didn't just want to end her life. He wanted to break her soul. He waited until the house was quiet. He started with the youngest children, his biological daughters, Coy and Kaylee. He took them out to the car parked in the garage. He didn't use a weapon on them. He simply placed them in the back seat, rigged a hose from the exhaust pipe into the window, and let the car run. He sat there and waited while his own children succumbed to carbon monoxide poisoning, dying in their sleep. Once they were gone, he carried their lifeless bodies back into the house and tucked them into their beds, arranging the covers as if they were just sleeping. It was a macabre display of tenderness from a man who had just killed them. Next, he turned his attention to his stepchildren, Chadney and Kara. They were teenagers, old enough to fight back, so he used a gun. He bound them with duct tape, dragged them into the basement, and shot them both execution style. But he didn't do this in secret. He did it in front of their mother, Faith. He forced her to watch the execution of her firstborn children. Finally, he turned to Faith. He shot her in the foot and slashed her face with a box cutter. But he didn't kill her. That was the cruelest part of his plan. He wanted her to live. He wanted her to wake up in the hospital and realize that her entire world was gone. He wanted her to carry the burden of the massacre for the rest of her life. He wanted to leave her alive in a house that was now a tomb. At 1:15 a.m., Gregory Green picked up the phone and dialed 911. Just like he did in 1991, he was calm. He told the operator, "I kill my family." When police arrived at the suburban home, they found Gregory standing in the driveway, hands raised, waiting to be handcuffed. He didn't run. He didn't fight. He looked like a man who had accomplished exactly what he set out to do. Inside the house, officers found a scene of unimaginable horror. The two teenagers dead in the basement. The two little girls dead in their beds, looking peaceful but cold. And Faith, bleeding and traumatized, bound with duct tape, surrounded by the bodies of her children. The aftermath of the crime left the community and the nation reeling. Questions were asked about why a man who had murdered his pregnant wife was ever released. The parole board defended their decision, saying he had followed all the rules. But Faith Green, who survived her physical injuries, had a different message. At his sentencing, Gregory Green stood before the judge, showing little emotion. He claimed he felt bad, saying, "I feel like the weight of the world is on me." But Faith, sitting in a wheelchair due to her injuries, delivered a victim impact statement that silenced the courtroom. She looked at the man she once loved and said, "You are a con artist. You are a monster. You are a devil in disguise." She spoke of the torture of living without her children, of the silence in the house where laughter used to be. Gregory Green pleaded no contest to 4 counts of second-degree murder. The judge, calling his actions the worst kind of evil, sentenced him to 47 to 102 years in prison. Given his age, it is a life sentence. He will die behind bars. Gregory Green is a terrifying reminder that some predators are patient. He fooled a parole board, he fooled a pastor, and he fooled a wife. He used the concept of a second chance to sharpen his knife for a second slaughter. He is the stepfather who didn't just kill his family. He extinguished an entire generation because his ego couldn't handle rejection. He proved that for some men, prison isn't a rehabilitation center. It's just a waiting room. Case number 10, Luis Toledo. There is a specific kind of horror reserved for cases where the victims are never found. For the families left behind, there is no funeral, no headstone, and no place to lay flowers. There's only a void, a silence that stretches on for years, filled with the agonizing question of where their loved ones are resting. In October of 2013, in Deltona, Florida, an entire family vanished into that void. A devoted mother and her 2 young children disappeared from their home overnight, leaving behind only a clean house and a stepfather with a story that didn't add up. This is the story of a man whose jealousy was so explosive that he didn't just end a marriage, he erased a family. This is the case of Luis Toledo, a man who believed that if he could hide the bodies well enough, he could hide the truth of what he was. Yesenia Suarez was 28 years old, a woman known for her radiant smile and her fierce dedication to her children. She was a loving mother to 9-year-old Talia Otto and 8-year-old Michael Otto. To providing a stable home for them, she worked hard at her job with American Canine Detection Services. Yesenia was trying to build a future, but she was trapped in a volatile present. She was married to Luis Toledo, a man with a heavy build and a background in martial arts. On the surface, they were a family, but behind closed doors, the marriage was crumbling under the weight of Luis's intense jealousy and controlling nature. He was suspicious, he was aggressive, and he was terrified that Yesenia was going to leave him. By October of 2013, the end was near. Yesenia had begun to distance herself. She had found the strength to consider a life without him, a life where she and her children didn't have to walk on eggshells. On October 22nd, the tension in the house on Convent Court reached a breaking point. An argument erupted. It wasn't just a disagreement. It was the final confrontation. Yesenia confronted Luis about the state of their marriage. She stood her ground, and in response, the man who had promised to protect her decided to silence her. According to the details that would later emerge in a chilling interrogation room, Luis Toledo snapped. He claimed he didn't use a weapon like a gun or a knife. Instead, he used his hands. He delivered a chop to her throat, a move calculated to incapacitate and kill. In an instant, the argument was over. Yesenia was dead, but the horror was only beginning. The commotion had not gone unnoticed. The two children, Talia and Michael, were in the house. They were witnesses. They were old enough to speak, old enough to point a finger, and old enough to know that Daddy had done something terrible to Mommy. Luis Toledo made a decision in that moment that separates a crime of passion from an act of pure evil. He decided that he couldn't leave any loose ends. He didn't see Talia and Michael as children he had helped raise. He saw them as liabilities. He went to them. The details of their final moments are too horrific to dwell on, but we know that he ended their lives with the same cold efficiency he used on their mother. In the span of a single night, the house went from a family home to a morgue. But Luis had a problem. He had 3 bodies and a sunrise approaching. He needed help. He contacted a neighbor, Trenton Carelessness, often referred to as TJ, to help him move the cars and clean up the scene. Toledo went into preservation mode. He cleaned the house with a manic intensity, scrubbing away the physical traces of the violence. He drove Yesenia's car to a parking lot to stage a disappearance. He tried to make it look like she had simply packed up and left with the kids. When Yesenia didn't show up for work the next day, her family knew something was wrong. Yesenia never missed work without calling. Her mother requested a welfare check. When police arrived at the house, Toledo played the role of the confused, abandoned husband. He told them she had left him. He feigned ignorance. But the police were suspicious immediately. The house was too clean. There was a smell of cleaning supplies that masked the scent of life. And Toledo's behavior was erratic. He was wiping his phone, deleting data, and acting like a man with everything to hide. The interrogation of Luis Toledo was a psychological chess match. Detectives pressed him on the discrepancies in his story. They pointed out that mothers don't just vanish with their kids without taking clothes or money. Under the pressure, Toledo cracked, but only partially. He admitted to killing Yesenia, claiming it was self-defense or an accident during a fight. He even demonstrated the throat chop to the detectives, a moment of physical reenactment that chilled the blood of everyone watching the tape. But when it came to the children, he clammed up. He tried to pin the blame on the neighbor, claiming someone else killed them. He refused to say where they were. The search for the bodies was one of the most exhaustive in Florida history. Police searched landfills, woods, and dumpsters. They sifted through tons of garbage, looking for a bone, a piece of clothing, anything. But Luis Toledo had done his job too well. To this day, the bodies of Yesenia Suarez, Talia Otto, and Michael Otto have never been found. They're still out there, somewhere, hidden by the man who was supposed to be their stepfather. The trial in 2017 was a heavy, emotional affair. Without bodies, the prosecution had to rely on circumstantial evidence, the blood found in the house, and the testimony of the neighbor who helped move the cars. But the evidence was overwhelming. The jury saw a man who had the motive, the means, and the opportunity. They convicted Luis Toledo of second-degree murder for Yesenia and first-degree murder for the 2 children, Talia and Michael. The distinction was important. The jury believed the killing of the children was premeditated, a calculated decision to eliminate witnesses. Luis Toledo was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He sits in a cell today, the keeper of a dark secret. He is the only person on earth who knows where those 2 beautiful children and their mother are resting. He holds the map to the family's closure, and he refuses to give it up. He is the ultimate evil stepfather, a man who wiped an entire family off the face of the earth because he couldn't handle rejection. If you found these stories as gripping and disturbing as I did, please make sure to hit that subscribe button and like the video. It helps us continue to bring these forgotten voices to light. And I have a question for you regarding this final case. Luis Toledo avoided the death penalty because the jury at the time could not reach a unanimous decision, so he got life in prison instead. Do you think that in cases where a murderer refuses to reveal the location of the bodies, denying the family a funeral, the law should prevent them from ever receiving any leniency or privileges until they give up that location? Let me know your verdict in the comments below.